Karen Grassle was once the gentle heart of a television family that millions adored. On screen, she embodied grace, patience, and compassion, the mother every child wished they had. But when the cameras stopped rolling, her reality was far from the image she projected. For decades, she carried a silence that weighed heavier than anyone could imagine. Only now, in her 80s, is she pulling back the curtain on a truth that has left longtime fans heartbroken. When Little House on the Prairie premiered on September 11, 1974, few could have predicted the cultural impact it would have. Adapted from Laura Ingalls Wilder's novels, the show quickly became one of television's most enduring family dramas. At the center of that success was Karen Grassle, a classically trained actress who had cut her teeth on Shakespearean theater before landing what seemed like the role of a lifetime. Caroline Ingalls, the matriarch of a frontier family. Audiences were instantly drawn to her performance. Week after week, she embodied everything a mother was supposed to be: tender, wise, patient, and endlessly resilient. Children who watched the series in the 1970s and 1980s grew up seeing Karen as Ma, the gentle hand guiding the Ingalls family through hardship. Parents admired her too, often remarking that she seemed to be holding the family together not just on screen, but in the hearts of viewers at home. To millions, she became a symbol of stability during a time of cultural change in America. On the surface, Grassle had achieved what every actress dreamed of: a starring role in a hit series, national recognition, and the admiration of a devoted fan base. Behind the scenes, however, the power dynamics were far more complicated. Her co-star, Landon, was not only the leading man but also the creator, writer, executive producer, and frequent director. He controlled storylines, casting, and the overall creative vision. It was, in every sense, his show. At first, Grassle respected him deeply. Landon was charismatic, funny, and known for his tireless work ethic. He often stayed late on set, overseeing every detail, determined to make the series a success. Karen admired that commitment and believed she was working alongside a creative genius. For the first few seasons, she focused on doing her best work, grateful to have been cast in such a central role. But as the show's popularity exploded, she began to notice something unsettling. While Landon's influence grew, her own contributions were not being valued in the same way. Despite the emotional weight her character carried, the scenes that made audiences cry, the moral backbone she brought to countless storylines, her paycheck remained a fraction of what she believed she deserved. Landon negotiated bigger contracts, enjoyed perks as both star and producer, and was constantly celebrated as the driving force of the series. Meanwhile, Grassle quietly accepted her original agreement, telling herself that recognition would come with time. It didn't. Season after season, the imbalance remained. For years, she kept quiet, smiling in interviews, posing for promotional photos with Landon, and maintaining the illusion of harmony. But inside, resentment began to build. She knew she wasn't just another supporting character, she was the heart of the show. And yet, she was being treated as if she were replaceable. This conflict between the public image and the private reality marked the beginning of a long and painful journey for Karen Grassle. She had landed the role of a lifetime, but it came at a cost she could never have predicted. And when she finally gathered the courage to confront the unfairness, the consequences would haunt her for decades. By the late 1970s, Little House on the Prairie had become one of the most beloved shows on television. Families gathered each week to watch the Ingalls clan navigate life's hardships with warmth and resilience. The series had already cemented itself as more than entertainment. It was a cultural ritual. Ratings soared, and Landon, as Charles Ingalls, was praised for both his acting and his leadership behind the camera. But for Karen Grassle, whose character was the emotional anchor of the series, the reality was far less uplifting. Despite her essential role, her paycheck lagged far behind those of her male counterparts. Landon's salary was understandably higher given his multiple positions as star, writer, producer, and occasional director. But the disparity was glaring. Karen wasn't asking to match Landon's earnings. She knew the difference in titles and responsibilities, but she could not ignore the fact that she remained bound to her modest original contract while the show became a runaway success. Fans loved Ma. Critics praised her warmth. The network relied on her character to give the show its emotional weight. Yet financially, she was treated as if she were peripheral. For years, she kept quiet, believing that patience and professionalism would eventually be rewarded. But by 1977, as the show entered its prime, she decided she could no longer stay silent. Carefully and respectfully, she approached Landon to ask for a raise. Her request was measured. No ultimatums, no emotional appeals, just a simple acknowledgement that her contribution merited better compensation. Landon's response stunned her. There was no support, no attempt to negotiate. Instead, his answer was cold and dismissive. According to Karen, that moment marked a turning point. Almost immediately, she began to notice subtle changes in the scripts. Caroline Ingalls, once the moral and emotional center of the family, was written with fewer lines. Emotional speeches were shortened. Family dinners that had showcased her nurturing presence were cut back, and storylines increasingly revolved around Charles. The shift was not dramatic enough to draw public attention, but it was deliberate enough for Karen to feel its sting. She later described it as a form of punishment, a quiet reminder of who truly held the power. It wasn't just about money, it was about control. By diminishing her role, Landon made it clear that challenging him came with consequences. The retaliation didn't stop with the scripts. On set, Landon's once charming sense of humor took a darker turn. His jokes, once playful, became crude and personal. Karen recalled that during intimate scenes, he sometimes made sexual remarks in front of the crew, comments designed not to make her laugh but to make her feel small. The crew, caught between loyalty and discomfort, often laughed nervously. Karen did what she had always done. She smiled, stayed professional, and carried on. But each remark chipped away at her sense of dignity. In Hollywood of the late 1970s, women who spoke out against mistreatment risked everything. The label of difficult was career-ending. Karen knew that if she complained publicly or pushed harder, she could lose not only her job but her entire future in television. So she swallowed the humiliation and kept silent, convincing herself that the sacrifice was necessary to protect the career she had worked so hard to build. But silence does not erase pain, it only buries it, and the more she endured, the heavier the burden became. What had started as a professional disappointment was turning into a personal ordeal, one that left scars she would carry for the rest of her life. After the failed negotiations, the atmosphere on set changed in ways Karen Grassle could never have predicted. To the millions of viewers watching at home, Michael Landon remained the perfect father figure, warm, moral, and endlessly devoted to his family. But behind the scenes, his behavior toward Karen grew increasingly difficult to bear. According to her memoir, Bright Lights, Prairie Dust, Landon began to use humor as a weapon. What once passed as light-hearted teasing soon became sharp and vulgar jokes, often delivered in front of cast and crew. During intimate scenes between Charles and Caroline, he would make comments about her body, loud enough for everyone to hear. The crew laughed nervously, but for Karen, the remarks were demeaning and humiliating. She smiled on the outside, stayed in character, and continued to play her role. Inside, however, she carried the shame in silence. The imbalance of power was unmistakable. Landon was not only her co-star but also the show's leader, controlling the scripts, directing episodes, and shaping how characters were portrayed. Challenging him openly could have meant the end of her career. At nearly 40 years old, Karen knew that prime roles for women were already scarce. She had worked too hard, trained too long in theater to risk everything by speaking out. So she endured the offhand remarks, the reduced role, and the constant reminders that she was subordinate. Each time she sat beside Landon in interviews, praising his talent and humor, she felt the weight of betrayal against herself. It wasn't just the paycheck or the crude comments. It was the knowledge that she had to swallow her pain and pretend it didn't exist. The silence haunted her for years. She had been cast as a mother who held her family together through strength and quiet resilience, and in a cruel twist of fate, that was exactly how she survived behind the scenes. But silence comes with a cost, and as the years went by, the burden only grew heavier. Still, she kept her head down. She showed up to set, delivered her lines, and smiled for the cameras, even as the personal toll mounted. But the humiliation did not stop there. Soon, rumors began to circulate on set that would deepen her sense of isolation and highlight just how untouchable Michael Landon really was. As the 1970s wore on, whispers began to ripple through the set of Little House on the Prairie. At first, they seemed like ordinary Hollywood gossip, rumors that no one dared to confront directly. But for Karen Grassle, those whispers soon became an undeniable reality. Michael Landon, the family man adored by millions, was reportedly having an affair with Cindy Clerico, a much younger stand-in and makeup artist on the show. Karen would later confirm that the rumors were true. Landon, who was married at the time, carried on the relationship openly, often in plain view of the cast and crew. What shocked Karen wasn't only the affair itself, but how brazenly it unfolded. She recalled seeing Landon flirt openly, touch Cindy affectionately, or whisper to her within earshot of others. Sometimes he even joked about his revived libido during filming or in the makeup trailer. These weren't private indiscretions. They were flaunted, a performance of power in the workplace. For Karen, it was a bitter reminder of just how little protection she had. She was already enduring humiliation through jokes and diminished scripts, and now she was forced to watch her co-star, the man who controlled her career, ignore professional boundaries entirely. Everyone saw it, but no one stopped it. Producers, crew members, even fellow actors stayed silent. To confront him directly could mean being branded difficult, and in the Hollywood of the late 1970s, that label could destroy a woman's career. The double standard was glaring. Landon's behavior didn't damage his reputation at all. To many, it only added to his myth of charm and masculinity. But Karen had to remain poised and professional, acting out tender scenes with a man who was gradually dismantling the dignity of their working relationship. Each time she smiled in character, she carried the private knowledge of what was happening off-screen. It was another layer of isolation. Another reminder that Landon was untouchable. He could control the scripts, the narrative, and even the rules of workplace conduct. And Karen, like so many women in that era, had no choice but to survive quietly. She remembered everything, stored it away, and carried it like a weight that never left. Years later, those memories would return with full force when she began writing her memoir. But before that, she would experience one more chapter in her silent story, one that would bring both heartbreak and an unexpected act of grace. By the late 1980s, Little House on the Prairie had long since ended, and its cast had gone their separate ways. For Karen Grassle, the memories remained unresolved. She had endured years of humiliation in silence, carried the weight of unfair treatment, and buried it all to protect her career. Then came news that forced her to confront the past. Michael Landon had been diagnosed with an aggressive form of pancreatic cancer. The prognosis was grim. For many who knew Karen's story, the assumption was simple. Surely she would feel a sense of vindication, perhaps even relief. But when she heard that Landon was dying, her reaction was very different. She felt sadness. Despite everything, he had been an enormous part of her life. For nearly a decade, they had worked side by side. They had shared laughter on set, tears in emotional scenes, and created a show that still meant the world to millions. And now he was facing the end. Karen struggled with what to do. A part of her wanted to remain silent, as she always had. But another part, the part that had mourned the loss of a friendship that never quite existed, knew this was her last chance. So she sat down at her kitchen table and began to write. Not a letter of anger, not a list of offenses. Instead, she chose something different: forgiveness. She thanked him for casting her, for giving her the role that had touched so many lives. She acknowledged the pain but didn't dwell on it. She wrote from a place of closure, telling him that she forgave him. The words didn't come easily, but when the letter was finished, she sent it without knowing if he would ever read it. Weeks later, she heard from someone close to Landon. He had read the letter, and he wept. For Karen, that knowledge was enough. It didn't erase the years of silence, the indignities, or the humiliation, but it gave her something she never thought she'd have: peace. She kept that moment private for years, never using it for attention, never sharing it in interviews. Only decades later, when she published her memoir, did she reveal it to the world. For her, it wasn't about redeeming Landon's memory. It was about telling the truth, her truth, and finally releasing the burden she had carried for so long. But what came next, when she broke her silence in her 80s, was something no one could have predicted. No one could have. In 2021, Karen Grassle finally released her memoir, Bright Lights, Prairie Dust. It was not written as a scandalous tell-all. It wasn't bitter or vengeful. Instead, it was quiet, reflective, and deeply personal. But within its pages, Karen could no longer avoid the truth she had buried for decades. She laid bare the reality of working alongside Michael Landon, the unequal pay, the retaliation, the crude remarks, and the open affair that unfolded in front of the cast and crew. What made the book so powerful wasn't just what she said, but how long she had waited to say it. For more than 40 years, fans had clung to the image of Little House on the Prairie as the perfect family show with a perfect cast. Karen's revelations pulled back the curtain, showing that behind the beloved characters were very human struggles, humiliations, and wounds that never healed. The public reaction was immediate. Fans who had adored Michael Landon felt a mixture of heartbreak and betrayal, not at Karen, but at the realization that their childhood hero had been far more complicated than they ever imagined. Former cast and crew began to speak up, some quietly, others publicly, confirming pieces of Karen's account. They described a set that was not always the warm haven it appeared to be, but one where Landon's authority was absolute and his humor could cut deep. Karen never called him evil. In fact, she went out of her way to describe him as a man of contradictions, talented, magnetic, and generous, but also moody, controlling, and at times, cruel. That honesty made her story even more credible. She wasn't trying to erase his legacy. She was adding to it, painting a fuller, more truthful picture of what it had cost her to play the role of Ma. For fans, her courage meant more than nostalgia. It meant honesty. She became more than just Caroline Ingalls. She became a symbol of strength, a survivor who had endured the weight of silence and finally spoken her truth. And at 82, Karen Grassle's voice was louder and more powerful than ever. Karen Grassle's story reminds us that behind the smiles we see on screen, there are often struggles we never imagine. Her courage to finally reveal the truth has reshaped how fans remember not only her, but the legacy of Little House on the Prairie. Which part of her story touched you the most? The humiliation she endured in silence, or the letter of forgiveness that brought her peace? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more untold stories of Hollywood's hidden truths.